In the autumn of 1805, the most powerful coalition Europe had assembled in a generation was moving to destroy one man. Britain, Austria, and Russia had aligned their armies, their treasuries, and their political will around a single objective: stop Napoleon Bonaparte before he remakes the continent in his own image. Austria moved first. General Karl Mack von Leiberich led 72,000 troops into Bavaria, positioning them around the city of Ulm on the banks of the Danube, expecting the French to come from the west through the Black Forest, the same corridor armies had used for generations. Russian reinforcements were weeks behind him, but Mack was not worried. He had the river at his back, the forest to his front, and time on his side. He simply needed to hold. He had no idea that across northern Europe, 210,000 French soldiers were already moving, and none of them were coming from the direction he was watching. Within 3 weeks, Mack's entire army would be gone, not destroyed in a climactic battle, but swallowed whole without a major engagement. Within 3 months, Napoleon would manufacture the most studied trap in the history of pitched battle and spring it against a force that outnumbered him. And within 14 months, Prussia, the military kingdom built by Frederick the Great, regarded across Europe as the continent's finest fighting force, would cease to exist as a military power in a single afternoon. 3 armies, 3 defeats, 3 completely different methods. The question is not whether Napoleon was brilliant. The question is how he did it, what he saw that everyone else missed, and why the same pattern kept working against enemies who were watching him closely. Mack's assumption at Ulm was not careless. It was historically reasonable. The Black Forest was the natural approach from France into southern Germany, and every major French army of the past century had used it. He deployed his forces to meet that threat, anchored his position along the Danube, and waited. What he did not know, could not know, because Napoleon had made certain of it, was that the Grande Armée had already pivoted far to the north and was executing a sweeping arc through southern Germany that would bring it around and behind him. Napoleon's army operated on a core system, 7 independent formations capable of moving separately across hundreds of miles of road and converging precisely when needed. While Mack watched the western approaches, French corps were crossing the Rhine at multiple points far to the north, swinging northeast through Bavaria, then turning south and east, crossing the Danube east of Ulm. Marshal Murat's cavalry screened every column, blinding Austrian reconnaissance. The Austrians received no reliable intelligence about the movement. By the time Mack began to understand what was happening, French forces had already crossed the river behind him. The road back to Vienna was cut. The pocket closed from multiple directions simultaneously. Soult's corps moved southeast toward Memmingen, capturing thousands of Austrians and cutting off any escape toward Tyrol. Ney's forces fought to close the trap at Elchingen to the north. Other corps pushed in from the east, sealing the ring. Mack attempted several breakouts, but each ran into French resistance. A cavalry force of roughly 6,000 men under Archduke Ferdinand managed to slip through the closing net, only to be run down and forced to surrender weeks later. Napoleon even had an agent inside Mack's headquarters, Karl Ludwig Schulmeister, feeding the Austrian general false intelligence, suggesting the French were preparing to withdraw. Mack hesitated. He waited for Russians who were too far away to reach him in time. On October 20th, 1805, General Mack capitulated on the heights of Mikkelsburg above Ulm. Across the entire campaign, roughly 60,000 Austrians were captured or killed. The French suffered fewer than 2,000 casualties. There had been no great pitched battle. Napoleon had made one unnecessary. He had simply moved faster and farther than Mack believed possible, used the Danube as a wall instead of a barrier, and turned a geographic maneuver into a prison. The road to Vienna was now open. Napoleon marched in within weeks. Military academies would study the Ulm campaign for over a century. Its logic of envelopment through rapid movement would later influence the design of the German Schlieffen Plan before the First World War. But in 1805, its most immediate consequence was that it destroyed the Austrian army before the Russian one arrived. and that brought Napoleon to the edge of something far more dangerous. The Austro-Russian combined force that met him in Moravia in late November numbered around 85,000 men. Napoleon had perhaps 65,000 to 72,000. He had taken Vienna, but he was deep in enemy territory. His supply lines stretched, his army tired from weeks of forced marching. For the first time in the campaign, the numbers were against him. The Allied commanders, with the Austrian Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I both present in the field, sensed that the momentum had shifted. Even Kutuzov, the senior Russian commander, believed the French were overextended. He urged caution. He was overruled. Napoleon saw what Kutuzov feared but could not prevent. He surveyed the ground around a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. He studied the terrain personally. And then he did something that looked, on the surface, like desperation. He pulled back from the Pratzen Heights, a gently rising plateau that dominated the entire battlefield, and left it unoccupied. He sent his aide Savary to the Allied camp to request a ceasefire, projecting uncertainty and exhaustion. He allowed the enemy to read his right flank, near the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz, as dangerously thin. Everything he showed the enemy was designed to tell one story. The French were weakening. The right flank was the opportunity. The time to strike was now. The Allied plan, drafted by Austrian Chief of Staff Weyrother and accepted over Kutuzov's objections, was not irrational. It was built on exactly the picture Napoleon had painted. Their left wing would descend from the Pratzen Heights, sweep south and around the exposed French right, cut Napoleon off from Vienna and the Danube, and drive him into the mountains. It was a plan designed to win the battle. It was also a plan that required stripping their center. What the Allied commanders could not see was the valley below the Pratzen Heights on the French side. Hidden in the low ground, masked by the dense morning fog that blanketed the field before dawn on December 2nd, sat the 16,000 men of Marshal Soult's 4th Corps, pointing uphill, waiting. They were the blade. Davout's 3rd Corps had force-marched nearly 70 miles in 48 hours from Vienna to reinforce the deliberately weakened right flank, arriving just in time to absorb the blow. On the French left, Lannes and Murat were ordered to hold their ground, and nothing more. Press, but do not push. Keep the enemy from sending reinforcements to a flank that isn't breaking the way they think. The trap required timing. Napoleon had to wait until the Allied left wing had moved far enough south and downhill that the Pratzen was truly empty. Too early, and Soult would hit the heights before they were stripped. Too late, and the right flank might collapse before Davout's men could stabilize it. Napoleon watched the Allied columns descending from the plateau through the morning fog and waited. When he was certain the center was hollow, he gave the order. The fog was beginning to lift. Later accounts would call the moment when sunlight broke across the battlefield the sun of Austerlitz. Soult's division surged forward and up the slope of the Pratzen Heights, driving into an Allied center that had gutted itself to feed the flank attack. The heights fell quickly. The Allied line was split in two. The left wing, now committed far to the south near Telnitz and Sokolnitz, found itself fighting in the wrong direction. Davout's exhausted but steady corps was holding the line they were supposed to break. And behind them, to their north, French forces were now on the high ground and turning to drive downward into their flank and rear. The escape route south led across frozen ponds. Period accounts describe Allied soldiers and guns attempting to flee across the ice as French artillery opened fire on the ponds. Some historians debate the full scale of the episode, but what is clear is that thousands of men in the Allied left wing found retreat cut off or made catastrophic. The Allied losses across the field reached roughly 27,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The French lost around 9,000. Kutuzov, who had warned this would happen, was proven right in the worst possible way. Russia withdrew from the coalition. Austria signed the Peace of Pressburg on December 26th. The Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed for nearly 1,000 years, dissolved within months of the defeat at Austerlitz. Napoleon stood at the peak of his power in Western Europe, and Prussia, which had watched all of this from the sidelines, decided it had seen enough. The Prussian ultimatum arrived in October 1806. It demanded that France withdraw from German territory or face war. Prussia's confidence was not unfounded. Its army carried the prestige of Frederick the Great. Its officers believed they led the finest military force in Europe. Prussian mobilization had begun almost a month before Napoleon responded, which in theory gave them time to organize, consolidate, and link up with the Russian forces moving from the east. Napoleon had already anticipated the ultimatum. His Grande Armée had never fully demobilized after Austerlitz. His corps were concentrated in southwestern Germany, and when the order came to march, they moved northeast through the passes of the Thuringian Forest in a formation designed to function like a moving net, 3 massive columns advancing in parallel, close enough to support each other, wide enough to catch any Prussian concentration between them. The Prussian command could not find a coherent response. King Frederick William III, the Duke of Brunswick, Prince Hohenlohe, and General Ruchel each held pieces of the army. There was no unified operational authority, no single mind directing the whole. Prussia had prepared for a deliberate campaign with time to organize. Napoleon gave them no time at all. On October 14, 1806, 2 battles began simultaneously approximately 12 miles apart, and neither Napoleon nor his Marshal Davout fully knew the details of what the other was facing in real time. At Jena, Napoleon assembled roughly 90,000 men through the night on the Landgrafenberg Plateau, a logistical feat in the dark that his officers would later describe as barely possible, and attacked at dawn. The force he struck was not, as he initially believed, the main Prussian army. It was Prince Hohenlohe's corps, perhaps 38,000 strong. French skirmishers tore apart the rigid Prussian linear formations. Flanks crumbled. Ruchel's reinforcements arrived too late and were absorbed and broken in turn. 12 miles to the north at Auerstedt, Davout's Third Corps, roughly 27,000 men, collided with the main Prussian army, more than 60,000 troops under the Duke of Brunswick. Davout was outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Early in the battle, the Duke of Brunswick was mortally wounded, decapitating the Prussian command at the moment it needed direction most. Bernadotte's First Corps sat positioned between both battles and moved to support neither, a command failure whose exact causes remain debated by historians to this day. But what is not debated is the result. Davout's corps, alone and outnumbered, held the field, fought the Prussians to a standstill, and then drove them back. By afternoon, both Prussian armies were in full retreat. The retreat became a rout. French cavalry hunted the broken columns across the countryside. Prussian fortresses, which should have been anchors for a defensive recovery, surrendered one after another with minimal resistance. On October 16th, a large Prussian force capitulated before Murat at Erfurt with barely a shot fired. On October 26th, Davout's corps entered Berlin. Within weeks, Napoleon was standing in Frederick the Great's palace at Potsdam. Prussia, the kingdom that had defined military power in Central Europe for half a century, had been erased as a fighting force in a single afternoon. The defeat broke something deeper than the army. Several officers who survived Jena-Auerstedt, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, a young Karl von Clausewitz, spent the years that followed trying to understand what had happened and rebuilding the Prussian military from the ground up. Clausewitz would eventually write On War, one of the most influential works on military theory ever produced, partly as an attempt to dissect the logic that had destroyed them. David Chandler, one of the foremost historians of Napoleonic warfare, described the 1806 campaign as a blitzkrieg without internal combustion engines. The phrase holds. The speed, the convergence, the inability of the enemy to orient and respond before the decisive blow landed. It was the logic of modern operational warfare, executed with horses and boots on roads through a German forest. 3 campaigns, Three completely different enemies, three completely different tactical solutions, but the same underlying logic in everyone. At Ulm, the Austrians prepared for a battle Napoleon never came to fight because he was already behind them, cutting the road they needed to survive. At Austerlitz, the Allied commanders prepared to exploit a weakness Napoleon had built and lit like a lantern for them to walk toward, while the real blow waited in the fog below an empty plateau. At Jena-Auerstedt, Prussia prepared for a deliberate campaign with time and space to organize, and Napoleon closed both before they were ready. In each case, the victory was won before the main engagement. The battle was almost a formality. What Napoleon had already achieved, in his opponent's assumptions, in the positions he had already taken or denied them, in the timing he had already forced on them, made the outcome all but certain before the first shot. He did not simply fight better than the generals opposing him. He shaped what they believed, what they feared, and what they thought they saw. Then he punished them for seeing it. In 14 months, the Holy Roman Empire ended, Vienna fell, and the military tradition of Prussia collapsed. These three moves are still broken down in staff colleges and war colleges around the world. The Ulm campaign redefined what envelopment at operational scale could look like. Austerlitz remains the textbook example of manufactured deception on the battlefield. Jena-Auerstedt demonstrated what happens when a rigid military system meets one built entirely around speed, convergence, and the destruction of the enemy's ability to think. Whether that makes Napoleon the greatest general who ever lived, or simply the first commander to completely master the battlefield of his own time, is a question military historians are still arguing. But one thing is difficult to dispute. For those 14 months, no army in Europe could see what he was doing until it was too late to stop it.